Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life. A series of programs highlighting the social and cultural interaction between the worshiping and larger communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Area Conference of Churches in cooperation with KTBC. Join us now in today's Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for today's Austin Faith Dialogue. You've seen the televised stories of famine in Africa. Images of starving children and adults were flashed across this nation's screens as news of the Ethiopian hunger disaster spread several years ago. As drought and flooding and unceasing wars continue to create massive numbers of victims throughout Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Central and South America, we are media witnesses of world hunger. Those of the faith community have been active witnesses as well. The story of the feeding of the multitude has been taken as a mandate for Latter-day believers to take action. A bumper sticker making the rounds in Austin states, "Think globally, act locally." That local initiative of religious people will be one of our focal points for today's dialogue. Representing that perspective will be Martha Lohr, who has served on the organizing committee for the Crop Walk and is also a leader in the community-based faith food pantries. We welcome you, Martha. And we also have as our guest a visitor to Austin, one who will be able to provide a global view. He's Dr. Charles Kimball, Director of the Middle East Office of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA. Dr. Kimball oversees programs funded by Church World Service in that region of the world. And he's in our city at the invitation of the Texas chapter of Church World Service, CROP. Dr. Kimball, we're delighted to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
And as our guest from out of town, let me start with a question in terms of just what is Church World Service CROP for those who may be looking in and hearing of this for the first time.
Well, Church World Service is the ecumenical arm, the part of the National Council of Churches that's involved in rehabilitation, refugee resettlement, development issues around the world. It's the place where the 32 churches that make up the Council of Churches, the Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Lutherans, American Baptists, and so on, come together to try to work ecumenically so that we might use our resources in a more effective way, be better stewards of those resources in helping meet the very pressing needs that people all over the world face.
Okay, now that's Church World Service, and CROP, is that the food or hunger aspect of that?
It began as the Church's Rural Overseas Program many years ago, and that's how the word CROP came together. And it was basically an effort of people trying to provide food for starving people in other parts of the world. Today, that structure has evolved over a period of years, and today there are 27 regional offices of Church World Service / CROP that are involved in working locally at raising those funds, partly for local use, partly for use in the larger global context. And Austin is the home of one of those offices for Texas. That's involved in raising funds for world hunger and development.
Well, let's turn for a moment to the local scene. And Martha, you are on the group that's organized the Crop Walk here. And I think that it would be good for you to talk about the walk and what the purpose of it is and how many people are involved and so on.
Okay. The local Crop Walk is organized mostly by the churches. We invite participation from other organizations as well. It's one of those walks where all the participants try to secure sponsors who will say they will give so much money per kilometer that they walk on that day. It's become somewhat of a tradition in Austin to have this on what we call Palm Saturday, the day before Palm Sunday. And the next year's will be on March the 18th, which will be Palm Saturday. There's a committee that meets for about 6 months before that walk to make all the preparations.
All right. Well, now this coming as it does right after Thanksgiving is not too early to be thinking about that.
Oh, no. We've already had our first meeting.
All right. Well, good. I think what we'll be doing today is making a swing between the local and the global aspects of this and seek to bring it all together in terms of one response, just in different places. And in the introduction, I indicated that you had a specific responsibility in the area of the Middle East. This involves what countries?
Basically, the countries, the traditional countries at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, those countries that make up what we think of as the Middle Eastern countries. We also have some programmatic work, not much, in Syria, and my area technically covers Iraq and Iran, although we're not actively involved in particular efforts in those countries right now. We also include the North African countries, not sub-Saharan Africa, but the Arabic-speaking Muslim countries of North Africa, which are tied more culturally to the Middle East.
All right. Well, now you you come to Austin at this particular time to meet with the Texas Crop Church World Service organization. What's the tie-in there between what you have to bring in terms of the Middle East and those of us here in the Southwest?
Well, essentially, the resources that are provided for our work around the world come from three different streams. They come directly from contributions from the member churches. The various churches provide support to Church World Service directly. A number of people in your listening audience undoubtedly participate in the One Great Hour of Sharing, which is an ecumenical effort to provide resources for global assistance once a year, and a good portion of those funds do make it into the ecumenical channel of Church World Service. And then the third stream comes from those people who are involved in local initiatives, crop walks all over the country, who are then raising an additional amount of funds. Our pattern in Church World Service is that 25% of the funds that are raised in a local crop walk will stay in that local community and be used there for the hunger needs and the human service needs locally.
At that
the other
point,
part goes to the work around the world.
The 75% is global,
Yes.
25% local. And here in this locality, how is that 25% divided, Martha?
You can give keep up to 25%, and we've elected to keep 20% in the local community. 15% has gone in the past year to Capital Area Food Bank, and the other 5% to Austin Community Gardens.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
let me just add one point to tie back to your question. What specifically I'm doing here, what I and other people who work at the national level and link with our ecumenical partners around the world try to do is to connect as often as possible with people working at the local and regional level to help interpret for them precisely what the programmatic expressions are of our work in Church World Service around the world, so that people who are involved in local crop walks have first-hand knowledge of what precisely we're doing in a place like Lebanon or in the Israeli-Palestinian complex. And
Okay,
that's the purpose of this trip, is really an educational one.
Let's say then that you're here for purposes of interpretation and to help people on the local scene know that this has impact in the West Bank or in Lebanon or some of the places in the Middle East where you have connections.
Yes.
I'm trying to visualize in my mind, for instance, you're here in Austin today, and maybe next week you'll be in Beirut, and in the meantime stop off in New York to check in the office.
And hug and kiss my children as well before I go on to.
Yes, I would hope that you'd remember to do that. And but once you arrive in the Middle East,
Yes.
let's just say you get off the plane. Let's you pick the place and tell us, you know, how you would get food, help expedite the purpose here of distribution of food to meet hunger?
Well, let me make 2 points. First, it should be noted up front that the Middle East, the issues that we deal with in the Middle East in terms of human need are different than in sub-Saharan Africa today. We're not dealing with the problem of mass starvation, although there are certainly many, many people who are caught, particularly in conflict situations, who have tremendous needs, be they medical, food, shelter, clothing, what have you. And we are actively involved working through the churches and interfaith efforts in those areas. So what I'm doing here is I will be telling people that what they're doing is really helping people in Lebanon, and here's how. We work together with the Middle East Council of Churches, which is an indigenous Christian body in the Middle East. There are between 10 and 12 million indigenous Christians in the Middle East. This doesn't come readily to mind for most people. We think of the Middle East in more stereotypical terms of the larger Arab Muslim population and the Jewish community in Israel. There are 4 times as many Christians in the Middle East as there are Jews in Israel, so it's not a small community numerically. It's a minority community among the larger Muslim community, to be sure, but it's a very large community in numerical terms.
But you don't limit your services to Christians.
No, but we work as a Christian organization with our ecumenical partners in the Middle East, and that is the churches. Their efforts that we're involved with through them are almost always interfaith. In the case of Lebanon, the Middle East Council of Churches is still based today in West Beirut. Now, if you know much about Lebanon, you know that is a remarkable statement at a time when the country is in a shambles and militias control the country. No government is in effective control. Some of the most extremist elements among the Shiite Muslim militias in West Beirut, in fact, control the area where the Middle East Council works. Yet it remains the one human service organization that does provide food, that does provide emergency medical care and clothing and blankets and temporary housing for people caught in this multi-sided civil war.
Well, that implies that it's got credibility.
It does have credibility, and it's 2 years ago, in fact, when the United Nations was trying to find more effective ways to provide emergency assistance in Lebanon in a nonpartisan way, of course. They found they couldn't trust even the Lebanese government, which in effect is one faction in the civil war. And they decided that the Middle East Council of Churches, working out of West Beirut, working with the Druze and the Sunni Muslims and the Shia Muslims and the various Christian communities, was the one place where people would actually go and expect that aid would be distributed equitably. Now, the theological basis for that as a Christian is that when people are in need, we want to try and help. If someone is thirsty, you try to provide them with a cup of cold water without distinction in terms of their religious affiliation. That isn't the question. The question is, how can we help? And the churches in the Middle East, for the most part, affirm this perspective, saying our role is to be a witness, a presence and witness in society, and to be in service to the larger society in which we're a part.
Well, I think that it brings to mind, I had an opportunity last Palm Saturday to be part of that crop walk. And I remember in some point it was said that this is not limited to Christians in Austin, that you have a cross-section of the population here participating. Is that true?
Yes, we had 14 denominations, over 100 congregations, and this included not only the Baptists and Catholics, Presbyterians, Methodists, and so on, but for the first time last year, Jewish congregations did join in the crop walk and served on the crop walk committee in the planning. So it's becoming even broader based.
How many people walked all together?
Oh, there were 1,200 and some who walked last year, and these were the sponsored walkers who had signed up people, and this brought in $68,000.
Okay. And how does that compare with like the year before?
Oh, well, the year before it was about 1,000 and $55,000. So not only did the numbers increase, but the amount of money each individual walker raised was.
I see. Well, that's a better figure than the gross national product. So we're glad for that. The fact that you're in Israel raises the question of, as a Christian organization, in terms of your support and so on, do you work among Jewish people as well as Palestinian people?
Well, again, our first point of contact as a church organization is with the indigenous Christian community among the Palestinians. because that's where the Christians are. But our efforts, in fact, through them move at the interfaith level. The program that we're involved with in Gaza, for instance, which has now been going for 40 years, because there have been refugees displaced since the fighting began in 1948, and Israel was created when the Arab states did not accept the creation of Israel and war ensued. A lot of people were displaced. Church World Service was one of the first organizations to come to assist those refugees, and we're continuing that work today. That work in Gaza, only a tiny percentage of the population of Gaza is Christian, only about 2% of the Palestinians, as opposed to about 10% of the Palestinians in general are Christian. But they're involved in human service work with hospitals, with mother-baby health care clinics, vocational training programs, things like this that are benefiting the whole community. We do also have programs working within Israel itself. One in particular is a program called Interns for Peace, which is a Jewish-run organization that uses interns who are Jewish and Arab, but primarily Jewish, working in local villages to develop community centers, to develop sports programs, exchange programs between schools. They operate on the basis that the future for Arabs and Jews living together within Israel, now we're talking the pre-67 borders of Israel, not the occupied areas, the future for Jews and Arabs living together as Israeli citizens has to be seen as one, and so they're trying to find ways of developing that community sense and cooperative relationship, and we're involved in helping efforts like that as well within Israel.
Well, that reconciliation ministry within the land of Israel is beyond our food focus in a sense, but it seems to me it grows out of the same motivation that leads to the totality of your work. And as you go outside to the West Bank, to the occupied territories as they're called, Gaza, is the food need there grown sharper as a result of what they call the uprising?
Yes, in the last 10 months since the Palestinian Intifada, or Palestinian uprising, has occurred, the human service needs have increased rather dramatically. The United Nations now has doubled, in fact, its efforts working with Palestinian refugees. So it's a time of real difficulty for people caught in that conflict. I think there are a couple of messages that are very important here. One, when you're involved in humanitarian assistance over a 40-year period, the message begins to come through that just providing emergency assistance is not the whole answer. And if we're listening to our friends and partners in the Middle East, be they Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, and this I think applies to all the communities, one of the things that they say to us loud and clear is that particularly as American citizens, we have a responsibility, yes, to help them if we can in material ways, and that's very important in the short term, but the larger set of issues really involve the political conflict. What people really need is a resolution to their political conflicts, and that we in the United States do bear a particular responsibility in that regard, since ours is not the government of Sweden or Switzerland, and what the United States government says or does, whether it be helpful or not so helpful, really impacts the lives of people fairly dramatically, and we have to take responsibility then as citizens for what our government says and does, try to encourage steps that really do move towards peace and reconciliation.
Well, if we take the work of the Church World Service CROP as wanting to do more than simply meet emergency needs, continue that, but expand beyond that, I'm wondering if there's any counterpart to that in our area here, Martha. Can you?
I'm not quite.
In terms of, for instance, is the work that's being done, the 20% of the money that is left here in Austin, is it all going for meeting people's emergency food needs, or is there something what we would call developmental aspects to the program to help people supply their own food needs?
Well, Austin Community Gardens, of course, does help people provide their own needs. They plant and grow their own food. The Capital Area Food Bank, the money that goes to that supports agencies directly with food, of course, but this frees funds that they would have had to spend on food for their other programs. There are things like the Battered Women's Center and Austin Family House, which help women to become independent, and there are many programs that do help in that way other than just feeding.
So there is a local counterpart to what Charles is talking about in the Middle East.
There is another aspect to the Crop Walk too. Crop is not only the fundraising arm but the education arm in the local community. And as a part of the Crop Walk, we try to educate the individual walkers and have organizers within each church that try to educate their congregation as to what's going on in the world. There's also, usually sponsored by Bread for the World, while one of the rest stops on the Crop Walk, they have supplies and suggestions of people that you might want to write to in order to affect public policy.
It happens that in our program next week, Arthur Simon, the director of Bread for the World, will be our guest, and it'll be part of a two-part series that will look at the world hunger issue and the response to that, both locally and globally, from two different perspectives.
Can I just add one other note on this? I think all of us could readily agree that issues of world hunger are linked also to the matter of education and advocacy, because the reason for the plight of people often can be found in structures. That does not mean
natural disasters. It's
not just natural disasters, but I also want to say that doesn't mean there are easy answers or simple solutions. Anyone who would come along and say, here's the political solution to the Middle East, be very wary, because it's not that simple. So what we're trying to do, I think, through Church World Service at a national, international, and at local level is to labor and wrestle with what are the issues that we need to try and wrestle with. How can we find some answers? We know that there are some answers. We don't have all the answers, but we're wrestling to try and find those. And get other people engaged in that same process.
Okay, now when you do that, when you go beyond meeting emergency needs that everyone could agree needs to be done, and you start talking about what are the causes that what creates hunger, you get into politics. And I have to pause just long enough here, Charles, to take note of the fact that the National Council has been perceived as not altogether favorably by some branches of the Christian community that think that it's a liberal, to use that L word, arm of the church. In the Jewish community, I think that there seems to be locally some perception that it's Palestinian in its advocacy, pro-Palestinian. Can you give us any quick answer to those perceptions?
Well, certainly when you're dealing with the Middle East, let's take that as the specific case in point, there's no way that you can do anything that isn't political. If you provide food assistance to Palestinians, that is a political act in this conflict. If you're working with Israelis, that is perceived as a political act. I think you're correct that the perception is that the National Council of Churches is pro-Palestinian somehow. Although I can tell you, I spend more of my time dealing with people who think that we're much too soft on Israel, much too sympathetic to Israel, and not taking seriously enough the real justice concerns being raised by the Palestinian community. So we get it from both sides, and that happens when you're dealing with something that is as highly charged as this. I find it a particularly interesting point that you raise. I happen to be a Southern Baptist, which is very unusual in the National Council of Churches. In fact, I am the Southern Baptist in the National Council of Churches. And I have a particularly interesting history in that my grandfather, my father's father, was Jewish. It's a very colorful story, actually, that goes beyond the time we have here, but he was in vaudeville and met and married a Presbyterian chorus girl. And so he and his brothers remained Christian. I mean, my father and his brothers became Christian, but the larger part of my family is Jewish. And so being very close to the Jewish community and myself speaking a lot within that context, working very closely with many of the major Jewish leaders in the country, I know that perception doesn't hold across the board, but often the perception in areas away from New York or out across the land is that, and I think it's important to get those issues on the table and to try and discuss why we have these perceptions rather than just assume that they are true.
I wish we did have more time. I would like to know more about this Presbyterian chorus girl that you're talking about.
Well, I have some pretty racy pictures from 1906, but not by today's standards, I would say.
I think that the controversy that we're talking about on the national, international scene is we don't seem to have had that locally. But I think when you get into education, as you were talking about before, Martha, you would have people with differing views, and learning how to disagree agreeably would be part of that process.
Very important.
And there's in Austin what is called the Trialogue. Have you been part of that? Can you highlight that?
Not directly. We have had in our church some discussion with members of the group that includes Jewish, Muslim, and Christian people who are trying to get along together.
And those conversations are going on locally.
On a national basis, the efforts in the area of Christian-Jewish dialogue and relations have been very encouraging in many ways over the last couple of decades. It's also fair to say that the road is not an easy one. And I think, frankly, that Jews who are still a bit skeptical and a little wary of the intentions of people coming out of the Christian community are justified in that hesitancy. As one rabbi put it to me recently, he said, I like you very much, I trust you, but you have to remember that 2,000 years of Christian love is almost more than we can bear. So it's understandable if there's some real hesitancy. And I think it puts more of a burden back, I think, on the majority community in the U.S., which is Christian, to try and really be understanding and empathetic to the real fears and concerns of people in other communities.
Okay. In the brief time that we have, I think it's only fair that we should give you an opportunity to talk about Hope Food Pantries in Austin as another local response to this.
Faith Food Pantries.
Faith Food Pantries,
Okay.
beg your pardon.
Yeah.
Faith, Hope, and Love.
Yeah. Well, this is not directed at self-help. It's strictly a crisis help situation. There are 3 faith food pantries, and they're located in 2 Presbyterian churches and a Methodist church. And they provide just a 2 or 3 day supply of food to help someone over a rough spot. It's not even meant to be a continuing thing.
That's truly an emergency need then.
Yes.
And I think that we had a program earlier on hunger, particularly in Austin, that covered that more thoroughly, but it's worth coming back to. As we bring the reflections today to a close, I'd like to extend thanks to our guests, Martha Lohr, Dr. Charles Kimball, for your being with us. Their participation has helped us all to gain a deeper appreciation for the way in which the cooperative spirit is at work both locally and globally in feeding the multitudes. Join us again next week as we come to the second of this 2-part series on the local response to global hunger, and Arthur Simon, Executive Director of the Bread for the World, will be our guest. Until then, on behalf of the Austin Area Conference of Churches, I'm Richard Thompson.